The Leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Premier, in the most recent report from the Chief Electoral Officer, Mr. Nsenza, called for the strengthening of third-party advertising rules, and we expect his upcoming annual report will do the same. Premier, campaign finance rules are there to help create somewhat of a level playing field and to limit the degree to which money can be used to influence the outcome of an election. As long as third parties such as the Working Families Coalition are exempt from the same rules as other political entities, as the Toronto Star has put it, fairness is distorted. Premier, will you agree to the Chief Electoral Officer's request and introduce legislation to limit third-party spending?
Please. Thank you. Premier.
Mr. Speaker, well, as the interim leader of the opposition knows, we've taken a number of measures to make elections and election finances more accountable, Mr. Speaker. We're always open. Look.
The question was put without interruption, and so shall the answer. That includes anyone on that side.
We're always open to ways to improve Ontario's democratic process, Mr. Speaker. We always have been, we always will be. We have rules in place in Ontario to ensure that there's both transparency and free speech in our election campaigns, and obviously that's the balance that we have to strike, Mr. Speaker, but we have those rules in place. Third-party advertising rules were introduced in Ontario for the first time in 2007, Mr. Speaker. So the first time we had any rules around third-party advertising, it was our government that brought them in, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Supplementary.
Premier, by allowing the negative campaign ads to be paid for by your third-party friends, you allow them to do the dirty work for you. And that's completely unfair.
That's what it is.
They were allowed to spend $9 million more than the opposition parties, and they did it to attack mainly my party, freeing up your party to spend on positive campaigning. It's unfair, and you know it.
Order.
Last election, again, Mr. Speaker, for example, the third party, the NDP, spent a total of $2.6 million. Spent the largest third-party spender spent $2.6 million. That far outweighed what the NDP was allowed to spend in the last election. Premier, do you believe that allowing third-party interest groups to spend more than political parties is healthy for Ontario's democracy?
Thank you.
Again, Mr. Speaker, and I know the Attorney General is going to want to comment in the supplementary on this, Mr. Speaker, but again, from our perspective, finding that balance is very, very important. Under the current rules, third parties that spend $500 or more on election advertising are required to register with the Chief Electoral Officer, Mr. Speaker, and so that kind of transparency is important, Mr. Speaker, and that's the regime of rules that we put in place, Mr. Speaker. Again, I will say to the member opposite, he knows that we brought those rules in. He knows that we were the government that put any parameters around third-party advertising, Mr. Speaker, and we are always interested in suggestions for how we might improve the democratic process.
Thank you. Final supplementary. The member from Bruce Grey South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again to the Premier. The Chief Electoral Officer noted, and I quote, that Quebec, British Columbia, Alberta, New Brunswick, and the federal government have all adopted controls over third-party advertising, and that the jurisdictions in Canada that regulate third-party advertising, Ontario is the only one where third parties do not face advertising spending or contribution limits. To ensure fairness, I will soon be bringing forward a private member's bill that will introduce third-party spending limits.
Good man.
Premier, will you stand behind your word and support my initiative?
You're here.
Attorney General.
Be seated, please. Thank you. Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, the reason why the opposition party leader knows how this group contributed and how much they did, it's because of what we have done.
That's right.
We changed the rule, we changed the legislation. We're always open to the
Member from Leeds, Granville. Leader. Carry on, please.
So again, Mr. Speaker, it's because in 2007, this government introduced a third-party advertising rule, and under this current rules, a third party that spend $500 or more on election advertising are required to register with the Chief Electoral Officer. And registered third party must also report to the Chief Electoral Officer on election advertising expenses.
Thank you.
It's because of our change that you...
Thank you. New question? The member from Ottawa.